Hi, it's me. You may know me from my other videos where I talk about ancient Rome or classical myths. But today we are talking about something completely different, namely an interesting piece of crypto history. Recently, some internet sleuths found what they believe to be hidden prophecies in the notes of Blaise Pascal's book, The Wager, a classic of apologetics written in the 17th century. They say that these secret messages, including references to Bitcoin and blockchain technology, were left there by the author and only now are becoming discoverable with modern technology. Of course, this is pure speculation and can't be proven. But if true, it would make Pascal the world's first crypto prophet and raise some really interesting questions about the nature of prophecy, authorship, and interpretation. So here's the story. Pascal was a French mathematician, philosopher, and, yes, crypto prophet. Okay, maybe not that last one, but he did write a book called The Wager. It's actually called Orthodox, but the English translation is called The Wager, which is really fitting for our purposes. He wrote it over the course of his life and never finished it, so it was published posthumously, and the contents are a mix of his philosophical musings and religious thoughts and meditations. The whole thing is basically divided into 3 sections. The first deals with the uselessness of human reason. The second discusses the existence of God and the soul. And the third is all about the nature of happiness. Originally, the work wasn't intended for publication, and the ideas contained therein are often fragmented and incomplete. Some parts are just a few sentences long, while others take up several pages. But it's thought that the editor of the posthumous publication grouped them together based on subject matter. In 1669, the same year that Pascal died, a pirated edition of the Prophecies was published without the permission of his family, who eventually took the publisher to court because it contained blasphemous material, and ended up winning the case. This version became popular in England, but it had enough of a reputation that it was banned in France until the French Revolution. Anyway, the relevant part for us today is the section dealing with the existence of God and the soul, specifically part called The Wager, and it was in this text that the supposed hidden prophecies were found. The argument here is essentially that humanity is in a state of uncertainty about the existence of God. Either God exists or he doesn't. Either there is an afterlife or there isn't. So Pascal argues, why don't we take out the middle option and bet on God existing? So the wager goes like this. If you bet that God exists and he really does, then you win an infinite prize. If you bet that God doesn't exist and he really does, then you lose an infinite prize. If you bet that God doesn't exist and he doesn't, then you lose nothing. If you bet that God exists and he doesn't, then you lose nothing. Therefore, the rational thing to do is to bet on God's existence. That's because the infinite gain outweighs the finite loss, even though the infinite loss outweighs the finite gain. So it makes sense to believe in God. And now it's time for our first digression, which is to discuss why Pascal's logic is so compelling. The German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz pointed out that Pascal's reasoning commits the fallacy of using an infinite number to equalize itself to a finite number. But Pascal replies that the infinite surpasses the finite in the same way that the actual surpasses the potential. So if you have $10 in your bank account, but you think you might get rich someday, that future possibility counts as more than the $10, even though it's technically less tangible. In Pascal's mind, the prospect of going to heaven is infinitely more valuable than the finite prospect of being wrong and doing a little bit of extra research before claiming God exists. Also, Pascal's use of the word wager is a little bit misleading, because he doesn't mean the kind of bet that we think of when we hear that word. For him, it's more like a gamble or a calculated risk. He's arguing that it's rational to believe in God because the upside is just so much greater than the downside. And if you disagree, then you're taking on an infinite amount of risk for no good reason. That's why he says that those who deny the existence of God are the ones who are making the wager. Anyway, recently, some readers have noticed that certain passages in this text seem to describe technologies that weren't invented until hundreds of years later. And the strange thing is that these descriptions appear in an edition of Pascal's work that hasn't been tampered with. Here are a few examples. In one passage, Pascal writes, I assure you that if you go down into the mine, you will find the miners who have been there for 10 years with their clothes still on, their hands in their pockets, lying on their beds. They have only moved in order to turn themselves over and avoid gangrene. They are still there. The first thing I thought of when reading this was Dogecoin, since miners are still considered to be its developers. And if you want to support the channel, you can send me some Dogecoin at this address. But Dogecoin wasn't created until 2013, and the book was written in the 17th century. But okay, let's let the past stay in the past. There are other examples. Pascal describes the internet as a way for people to communicate instantly across great distances. He talks about smartphones and tablets and virtual reality headsets. He even mentions self-driving cars. And there are some other examples I won't mention here because they involve spoilers. Now, I'm sure you're asking yourself, how could Pascal have known about such futuristic technology? Well, there are two possible explanations. The first is that he didn't. These aren't actually hidden prophecies. They're anachronisms, and the reason they seem so jarring is that they come from the editor of the posthumous edition of Pascal's works, a man named Pierre Nicole, who was a member of the Jansenist movement within Catholicism. Added these passages himself to attract readers to Pascal's work, which had been largely forgotten. Or perhaps he did it to try to prove that Pascal's philosophy was somehow consistent with new technologies, even though that was probably not Pascal's intention. In fact, there are other similar anachronisms in Nicole's edition that are even more obvious, like when he describes the newly invented telescope and microscope as evidence of God's power. The second explanation is that these are indeed hidden prophecies left by Pascal himself, and they were only noticed now, because modern technology has made these topics more relevant, and because nobody cared about obscure 17th century books until recently. This seems less likely, but if true, raises some interesting questions. Did Pascal have a precognitive ability? Was he visited by future beings from the future who told him about all this stuff? Or was he just a master of metaphor, and was talking about how the human mind can conquer space and time, even before those things were literally possible? We may never know for sure. But if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.